I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you updates from across the battlefront, analyse the appointment of former Dutch PM Mark Rutte as the new head of Nato, and we discuss reports that the Biden administration is moving towards lifting a de facto ban on American military contractors deploying to Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 26th of June, 2 years and 128 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls and assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, thanks, David, and hello, wherever you are. So let's start in Ukraine on the ground. The Ukrainian attempts to collapse that Russian incursion north of Kharkiv and the Vovchansk area has continued. Geolocated footage published yesterday by the Institute of the Study of War shows continued marginal advance by the Ukrainians, slowly pushing that lodgement out or collapsing it. However, it is very slow and marginal, about the same, we think, as the sort of Russian efforts in the east in recent months. But it is going in one direction at the moment in Vovchansk. Elsewhere across the country, a Russian missile attack on the southern city of Odessa hit civilian infrastructure in the early hours of this morning. This comes from Regional Governor Oli Hipa. He said the attack damaged an administrative building in the industrial sector but caused no casualties. Then in the Donbass, Russian forces are attempting what's been described as relentless attacks on the strategically important town of Chasiv Yar. So Alexander, who's first name only, a platoon commander from Ukraine's 43rd Artillery Brigade, said, "We work, you could say, without rest. So no 2 days are alike. You always need to be ready to work day and night." He did say, though, that supplies of American ammunition have started to arrive after the $61 billion drawdown. Elsewhere in the area, in Donetsk, President Zelensky visited troops around the region. He's there today with his top military leadership. In a statement on Telegraph, Mr. Zelensky said he'd held detailed meetings on security with local military leaders, talking about a number of different issues. He said afterwards, "There will be a separate conversation in Kyiv, particularly with officials who must be here and in other areas near the front line, in difficult communities where people need immediate solutions that simply cannot be seen from Kyiv." And if those to whom he was directing these somewhat barbed comments were not totally hadn't got the message, he said he was surprised to learn that some relevant officials had not been in the region for 6 months or more. And he said, "There will be a serious conversation and I will draw appropriate conclusions regarding them." Sounds like someone's heading for an interview without coffee, as we used to call it in the army. Now, whilst he was there, President Zelensky also praised the work that has resulted in the return yesterday of 90 Ukrainian soldiers from Russian captivity. Among them were troops who defended Mariupol, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, as well as soldiers from the National Guard and the Navy. President Zelensky said, "We remember all our people in Russian captivity. We continue our work for the release of everyone. We seek the truth about everyone who may be held by the enemy." Talking of nuclear power plants, Russia's management of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant said that, so this is Russia's management, but they've said Ukrainian shelling has destroyed a radiation control post situated about 5 kilometers west of the power plant itself. The management said specialists carried out a number of compensatory measures to control the radiation situation in the area. That does sound alarming. However, I think it's just the language, because they did confirm radiation levels have not exceeded safe levels. As a reminder, Russian troops held or moved into the Zaporizhzhia plant very soon after the start of the full-scale invasion, and since then Ukraine and Russia have accused each other of endangering the safety around it. I know we've reported numerous times that the International Atomic Energy Agency are very concerned about the safety of the plant. It's said to be, the reactors are all shut down at the moment, so there's no immediate danger. However, the shelling of the cooling infrastructure is thought to be the biggest risk there at the moment, because you've got to keep it all nice and cold. Now, some statistics from the Ukrainian army or the military, and they say Ukraine has shot down 86% of Russian Shahed drones fired since the start of this year. So this comes not from the army, it comes from the head of the Air Force. Lieutenant General Mikhailo Oleshuk said that his forces had destroyed 1,953 out of a total of 2,277 Shahed kamikaze drones. These results were achieved due to an increase in the combat capabilities of the Ukrainian military's mobile fire groups, he added. Just so we're dialed back in, because it's been a little while since we looked at it. Shaheds are Iranian-designed uncrewed attack drones. Warheads can be up to about 50 kilograms, range over 1,000 miles, typically fired in swarms to try to overload any air defense, detonate on impact. Now, there has been a debate since the start of the full-scale invasion about how to look at these things, how to think about air defence, and whether you should look at the cost of the munition used to shoot down the drone compared to the value of what that drone may be destroyed. The argument is that a drone of just a few $1,000s, or if you use a weapon of hundreds of thousands of dollars to take down a relatively cheap drone, it doesn't matter. You should focus on the value of what the attacking drone might destroy. Now, I think the debate has moved on a bit from there. Be interested in your thoughts on this. I think as this war has moved into the attritional phase, battlefield economics are becoming increasingly important. So I think the pendulum on that debate is swinging back to, should you really be using air defense systems of hundreds of thousands of dollars a shot to bring down small, cheap drones of a few $1,000s a go? Interested in your views there. Now, speaking of battlefield economics, Ukraine's international partners have so far failed to significantly curb Russian defence production, a leading think tank has said. Rather, Russia has been able to continue accessing critical components from abroad, expanded the production of core weapons, and has continued to increase the sophistication of some key capabilities. That's the view of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, based here in London. RUSI Senior Research Fellow Dr. Jack Watling and another research fellow Gary Somerville. They've got a new report out today titled A Methodology for Degrading the Arms of the Russian Federation. Now, in this report, the authors explore the reasons why the West has failed to effectively disrupt Russian military production, despite efforts since 2014 to sanction certain individuals and various Russian entities, all in an attempt to disrupt the Russian sanctions, circumvention, and covert procurement of military components. But the authors make three main criticisms. They say governments have been too slow in acting. They've always reacted rather than be proactive. Western governments have also tried to conduct the relevant work at too high a classification, which has impacted the data sharing between intelligence agencies, officials, and the private sector, upon which much of the sanctions enforcement effort relies. And finally, they say many government officials and policymakers have maintained unrealistic expectations of how to measure effect. And they make the point that rather than preventing Russian systems reaching the front line, perhaps it would be better, maybe slightly more nuanced, but better to try to degrade the reliability of the systems as a whole, or reduce the volume produced, or increase the price, all of which would impose difficult trade-off decisions, as they see it, on Russia's military over the long term. And it is long term when you start talking about industrial warfare. The authors suggest a number of ways of making better taking the fight to Russia in this regard, which I won't try and pass it all now, but it's on their website, well worth a read. But they conclude that, quote, after 2 years of largely ineffectual and poorly cohered efforts, the time to act is now. And then just finally for me, David, I note today's British Defence Intelligence update that says several Russian Duma deputies, so the Russian Parliament, several Russian Duma deputies have recently expressed concern about the threat posed to law and order by returning ex-prisoners in Russia who have been fighting in Ukraine. So the chairperson, right, here we go, here's a business card for you. The chairperson of the Duma Committee on Family Protection, Issues of Paternity, Maternity and Childhood, Nina Ostanina, She was speaking to Russian newspaper Gazeta and said that there will be more crimes as these ex-prisoners are not socialised, as she says. She said that ex-prisoners should be constantly monitored by the law enforcement agencies. I'm sure they'll appreciate that. And she said society needed to be protected from them. Duma Deputy Maxim Ivanov also warned that there could be an increase in crime after the return of such people from war. Now, the Russian state has ceased to publish official crime statistics since the start of last year, actually, likely, in defence intelligence view, likely partly over the possible rise in violent crime committed by ex-prisoners returning from Ukraine. However, the independent Russian media outlet Verstka reported in April this year that at least 107 Russians have been killed and around the same number seriously injured by veterans returning from the conflict. So I mention that because there's quite a bit of detail. It's an interesting topic to look at, but it's just another one of these potential little messages, little just the signals coming back from Russia that all is not well. But clearly this point has been made before, especially with the way that Wagner went about recruiting from prisons, and we've seen anecdotal evidence of people who have been harmed and murdered by returning former prisoners who served in Ukraine, and it looks like the Russian Duma is seeking to take action. But I'll take a pause there, David.
Thank you, Dom. A quick message from us before we move on. This Saturday, on the 29th of June, Ukraine the Latest will be doing a live panel at the Stephen Joseph Theatre in Scarborough in the northeast of England. The show will be in the early evening, and myself, Dom, Francis and Roland Oliphant will be discussing the military lessons for the West from 2 years of the full-scale invasion. For tickets, just go to the Scarborough Fair website or follow the link which we've put in the show notes. We do look forward to seeing you there. Anyway, back to the episode.
Let's go to Francis Dearnley. There's quite a few different diplomatic and political updates, so let's break up your section, I think, and we'll bring in Dom a few times to get your thoughts as well. But Francis, first of all, what have you been looking at?
Well, thanks, David. As you say, lots going on. And perhaps the worst kept secret in Western politics, NATO has now at last formally appointed Mark Rutte as the next Secretary General, putting the outgoing Dutch Prime Minister in charge at this vital moment for European security. Mr. Rutte's appointment was sealed after months of speculation by NATO ambassadors during a meeting at the 32-nation alliance's headquarters in Brussels. President Biden and his counterparts will formally welcome him at the 75th anniversary summit in Washington in July. So it's farewell to Jens Stoltenberg, who, in case you missed it, Joe Barnes interviewed on the podcast for us last week. Western leaders have been congratulating Rutte on his appointment this morning, though an early challenge for him will be to persuade his fellow Western leaders to increase their defence spending to over 2%, when he himself was reluctant to do so as the Dutch Prime Minister. So why him, and what does it mean for Ukraine? Well, Rutte's been one of the key players behind Europe's military support for Kyiv since the full-scale invasion, and crucially is on record as saying that defeat on the battlefield for Moscow is vital to secure peace in Europe. So he's more hawkish than one might initially think. For context, his perspective on Russia is reported to have been heavily influenced by the downing of the MH17 airliner over Ukraine in 2014 by Russia-controlled operatives, which killed 196 Dutch citizens, a hugely significant event we've talked about in the past on the podcast, once somewhat forgotten, but actually has been a real, I think, symbolic event now in terms of how it's interpreted of the signs of the disaster that would come. And indeed, Roland Oliphant was vital in breaking that story and was one of the very first there on the scene. Now, a classic example of how historic events can have consequences far beyond the immediate. As I say, Rutte himself has been very majorly influenced by this event, and I'll be returning to it in my final thought too. So he's strong on Russia, and he's also strong in terms of his relations with Britain, EU and US leaders. He's sometimes nicknamed the Trump Whisperer for his good relations with the former US president, who could, of course, win the White House back in November. He's widely credited, Rutte, with rescuing a 2018 NATO summit by talking Trump round on defence spending. So quite a moment, which I know Dom has thoughts on in a second. But just before that, since we're on the subject of European leaders, as we reported last week, Ukraine has also began official membership talks with the EU. That's what happened yesterday, a major milestone in Kyiv's bid to join the Union amid its ongoing war against Moscow. Zelensky called it a historic moment and said that Ukraine is committed to fulfilling every requirement to becoming a member. And I mention it here because, again, it is evidence of whatever the short-term picture being, in terms of the broader political trends at the moment, whether that be in NATO, in Europe, there is much for Kyiv to be positive about at the present moment. The worst moment, it would appear, this year has passed. But that could change in terms of mood come November, depending on the results in the United States, of course, the country which I'll turn to next. But first, over to Dom on his reflections on Rutte's appointment.
Well, thank you, Francis. Dom, straight to you then. Mark Rutte, the new head of NATO. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'm not going to repeat anything that Francis said. I think Rutte's going to have his immediate problem is going to be accounting for defence spending under his watch in his country. So currently around about 1.7% GDP this year. Netherlands have committed to spending 2.03 for the next financial year, 2.01 for the year after. So, yeah, okay, getting over the 2% line, but they're not there at the moment and they haven't been under his watch. So that's going to be the big thorn in his side or the big weapon that will be used to attack him. I think in particular, he's got short-term and long-term issues. So short-term, he's going to immediately be faced with NATO's support for Ukraine and how it manages that, because NATO's just said it's going to take over the training and supply of equipment for Ukraine. And I said, what was it, last week? Yeah, how's that going to gel with the Ramstein process? There might be a seamless transition between the two, but there's going to be some bureaucracy, undoubtedly. And as we know, any sort of big government or administration level bureaucracy like that, there's going to be plenty of cracks for goodwill, policy, time to fall into. So the immediate problem is going to be how does he manage NATO's increasing role in the support for Ukraine? And then I think his longer term issue is going to be, well, maintaining NATO cohesion in the face of a long attritional war as it's starting to become very apparent with all the issues that requires. The shifting politics, such as policies moving the very firmly held lines like there's going to be no Western weapons fired into Russia, there's going to be no Western boots, either uniform or contractor or veteran boots on the ground in Ukraine, which now seems to be shifting. The wider support for Ukraine amongst the alliance. So these are all long-term but big things that could really unseat external support. The other thing I think is going to be there's going to be increasing calls led by Ukraine, obviously, but others for Ukrainian accession into NATO. He's going to have to manage this. He's going to have to manage the some members of the alliance like Hungary and Slovakia that are less keen on that. Politics in Europe is shifting. A lot of elections happening this year. You might find some very big hitters such as France taking a cooler, a less warm approach to Ukraine. How's that all going to stack up against increasing calls for NATO accession for Ukraine? Article 5 is the game in town. All these defence pledges and bilateral agreements are fine, but it's very clear that it's Article 5 or bust, really. So he's going to have to manage that. And as Francis said, Ukraine is also looking for EU membership. Now, that's separate from NATO, but not completely absent. There's connective tissue, and he's got to keep the balance there, because if one goes particularly ahead of the other, out of pace, that can upset it. So at his level, it's political rather than military. So all the things I've really highlighted, less the short-term stuff about training and equipment, really. But the longer-term issues is going to need a very canny political player, motivator and negotiator. Now, he's said to be that, which is good, but he's got some very big things coming down the tracks all the time with those that wish to reach for the, well, what was your GDP whilst you were in charge button. So, yeah, I mean, he arrives at a very difficult time for the alliance, but a time when the alliance is perhaps its most relevant since the end of the Cold War.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Francis, can I come back to you? Quite a lot to talk about in regards to the United States. Over to you, Francis Dearnley.
Well, thanks, David. And as Dom alluded to there, of course, the other challenge for Rutte will be his relationships with the United States, with Washington, whoever wins the presidency. And for several weeks now, one of the core focuses of our reporting has been on the evolving US position with regards to the war, particularly in terms of weapons deliveries and perhaps even more crucially, actually, permissions being granted as to their use. And on that theme, more interesting news out of DC today. According to CNN, the Biden administration is moving towards lifting a de facto ban on American military contractors deploying to Ukraine. That's coming from 4 US officials familiar with the matter who spoke to the broadcaster. That is to help the country's military maintain and repair US-provided weapons systems. As CNN report, the change would mark another significant shift in the Biden administration's Ukraine policy as the US looks for ways to give Kyiv's military an upper hand against Russia. Now, the policy is still being worked on, apparently, by administration officials and has not yet received the sign-off from Biden. Once approved, the change would likely be enacted this year and would allow the Pentagon to provide contracts to American companies for work inside Ukraine for the first time. Apparently, administration officials began to seriously reconsider those restrictions over the last few weeks as Russia made gains on the battlefield and, of course, the US funding initially stalled in Congress. So, again, evidence of how, as we've talked about many times, things had to get worse before they got better. Indeed, that is part of the tragedy of this war, I would argue. Now, Washington would, of course, be following the German companies who, as Dom talked about last week, have set up repair bases in Ukraine for their tanks and other material. It's an example of the US and West more broadly inching forward in its support of Ukraine, crossing certain self-imposed boundaries, just as others are doing. It is in policy shifts like this that one might, and I emphasise that word might, be seeing the impact of leaders like Emmanuel Macron talking more openly about the prospect of there being boots on the ground. Now, to stress, that is not what this would mean. This is not soldiers under the American flag. But once upon a time, I think even having representatives of American industry being on the ground would not have been seen as politically possible early on in this war. So this is an important moment, and it might express, as I say, the importance of these ideas being talked about, as Macron and Estonia's Kaja Kallas have done, and the latter of which, very interestingly, is set to be the EU's top diplomat, if reports are to be believed. So again, evidence that things may politically be going in an even more favourable direction for Kyiv in some elements, though of course that may all be superseded by the situation in the United States, so I continue to emphasise that. Now, Dom mentioned earlier on the RUSI report, which is well worth reading. We'll add a link in the description, about how governments have been overly reactive rather than proactive in disrupting Russian procurement networks. One could argue the same in terms of providing vital support in country to Ukraine, or at the very least by allowing Western businesses to engage. So that will potentially be about to change, and that could mark quite a significant moment. Now, staying with the US, as we report today, the US could threaten to halt weapons deliveries to Ukraine if it refuses peace talks under a Trump presidency. So that is a plan apparently being presented by 2 of his former Pentagon advisors. Russia would separately, as part of this proposal, be warned that any refusal to enter negotiations would result in increased military support for Kyiv, and a ceasefire would be arranged on the basis of the front lines as they are when talks begin. So this plan, and as I say, it is only a proposal, there's nothing formal being put forward, and it's certainly not the official US view, but this is what some are speculating be what a Trump vision may well look like. It was drawn up by retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg and Fred Fleitz, who both served as chiefs of staff under Trump's National Security Council banner. To encourage Putin to the negotiating table, the US would agree to suspend the possibility of Ukrainian membership to the NATO alliance for an extended period of time. So a lot of concessions, I think many would argue, being granted here. It's been put forward in a paper by the American First Policy Institute, a pro-Trump think tank where the former advisors hold these senior roles. It does indicate that this is the kind of thing we might expect, as I say, if, as Trump promised, to try and solve the war in 24 hours. So I think we can, as I say, start to see this formulating in certain ways. This would, of course, as I say, drive a wedge between Washington and its European allies, most of which have signed up to a Ukrainian peace plan that stresses talks can only begin after Russian forces withdraw from Ukraine. That is Rutte's view. The proposal would also result in Ukraine, of course, losing vast swathes of territory currently occupied by Moscow's troops. To emphasise, Russia still occupies about 18% of Ukraine. Now, crucially, and I say this unsurprised, but I think it is still revealing, this proposal has been partially endorsed by the Kremlin. So Dmitry Peskov, our old friend, has said the value of any plan lies in the nuances and in taking into account the real state of affairs on the ground. Putin has repeatedly said that Russia has been and remains open to negotiations, and we remain open to negotiations. So surprise, warm words at the prospect of this being the first bargaining chip that a Trump presidency might put forward. And I think the fact that they're approving this speaks volumes as to whether they interpret it or not as favourable to them. Now, just finally on this America segment, the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich has apparently, has appeared briefly in a Russian court with a freshly shaven head at the start of his behind-the-closed-doors spying trial in Russia. Of course, a charge the US journalist denies. He was flanked by a Russian officer, and he was standing in the glass box that we've all come to know, wearing a checkered shirt with his hands tucked casually in his pockets. Of course, he faces up to 20 years in prison if he is convicted of the charge. Putin has said he's open to the idea of some kind of prisoner exchange and that contacts with the US have taken place but remain secret. Nevertheless, we will, of course, continue to monitor this case closely, as we have done throughout. But an update there from the courthouse, which, of course, many people hoped would never get to this stage. But that's where we are with the US updates, David.
Thank you very much, Francis. Dom, can I come to you then? Just briefly, you had a rather interesting interview earlier today. We'll, of course, hear that in due course, probably on Monday's podcast, due to various different bits of admin in terms of we'll be away tomorrow, then away again on Saturday, and trying to find the right editor to edit it. But who were you talking to earlier, and what are your initial reflections?
Yeah, so today, Wednesday, is the 2-year anniversary of Operation Interflex. Now, this was the British-led but international training effort to train Ukrainian new recruits. It has expanded since then, but that was initially what it was set up to do. It grew out of Operation Orbital. That existed between 2015 and up to the full-scale invasion, 2022. That was inside Ukraine. I visited it in 2018. Again, this is British trainers taking new recruits through their initial training. So obviously the Orbital ended when the Russian full-scale invasion started, and it's now been expanded and reshaped. It's now Operation Interflex, and I spoke to the guy in charge, Colonel James Thurston, Commander Interflex. He was also a former commander of Orbital and a commanding officer of the Coldstream Guards. So Interflex it's now 12 international partners. They all send troops here to the UK. It is just over a third of the total international training support delivered by the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, which we understand as the Ramstein Group. Orbital, for comparison, between 2015 and 2022 trained 22,000 Ukrainian troops. Interflex has done 40,000, trained 40,000. It's expanded from, it was initially 3 weeks, that was deemed far too little for basic training. It's now 6 weeks, which is shorter than the British programme of Phase 1 training is about 10 or 11 weeks, and it takes the individual, the recruit, up to what we call pairs fire and movement. So the individual can look after him or herself, their weapon, and basic first aid, basic understanding of law of armed conflict, etc., and can operate with a partner. So one moving while the other's firing. So safe with a weapon, able to administer yourself in the field by cleaning yourself, cleaning your weapon, feeding yourself, sleeping efficiently, camouflage, concealment, all that kind of stuff. So the Interflex has now become a 6-week training course, and 6 weeks historically is what countries in a sort of major existential war or major war, that's what the conscripted folk have to go through. It's about 6 weeks. You'd ideally want longer, but 6 weeks historically was what they settled down on. So that's what it is at the moment. Of course, there is a lens of language through which that's going to take some time. For many of the folk arriving, English is not their first language. So 6 weeks might seem a little bit short with that, but it's better than it was. And as I say, it only focuses on basic soldiering, including law of armed conflict and that kind of stuff. Now, Colonel Thurston was saying that, so I asked him over the period since Interflex has started, if there's been any noticeable change in the motivation and morale of the recruits. And he said, no, not really, not at all. He said, if anything, there's a more dogged determination to get the job done in the people who are coming through now. And Interflex has expanded. They basically run 3 courses. So there's the vast majority is on new recruits, basic training, but they also train instructors, so Ukrainian instructors who can then go back into Ukraine and continue the work, the top-up training, because, of course, basic training isn't the be-all and end-all. You've got to keep that topped up. And also they then do a course for junior leaders, so private soldiers or junior non-commissioned officers who have fought in the war since the full-scale invasion, so have some experience. They now need to be consolidated in order to firm up that sort of spine of leadership that starts with the junior NCOs, the junior non-commissioned officers. So there's three courses running at any one time. But through them all, James was very clear. The priorities from the instructors, they are focusing on 2 things: survivability and lethality, making these people, giving them the best chance of them staying alive, so being able to operate as a soldier and look after themselves and others in the event of any injuries and what have you, but also to be the most lethal they can be, so to operate their weapon systems safely and effectively and understand where they fit into the wider part. And a lot of that goes down to, they use a lot of battlefield simulation in terms of sights, sounds and smells to try and get people over that initial panic and shock, fear when they're exposed to this stuff for the first time, so they can then, hopefully, the training that would then kick in. So it is very, very believable. It was very lifelike when I visited it in 2018, so I'm looking forward to visiting Interflex now to see what it's evolved into. So Colonel James, he praised in particular the Australian weapon instructors, weapon handling instructors, and the Estonian and Lithuanian instructors, who he said were really good because their countries are geographically and culturally closer to Ukraine. So they were really good on the sort of softer side of it. Just after the day's training is done, speaking to the recruits, just having that peer-to-peer, the band of brothers basically, that side of it, and shoring up their moral component, if you like. So it was a really interesting chat. I think we're going to try and get it out next week, the interview. I hope to go and visit Interflex soon, but it was very interesting to hear quite what they're going through. I then did ask him at the end, I said, so 12 nations, UK-led, but 12 nations, Australia, New Zealand, there's a lot of Europeans in there as well. I said, who's the best shot? And he refused to answer, so I guess it's not the Brits. But anyway, answers on a postcard. But no, that'll be coming soon. Thanks, David.
Thank you very much, Dom. And just as Dom said, we'll have that interview out next week, we hope. Francis, your final update, please.
Well, thanks, David. I'm looking forward to having a go with Dom in Scarborough to shooting range to see which one of us is the best shot. So answers on a postcard, folks. Anyway, just to end with an update on a subject we haven't really covered too much in the last few weeks, but I think is worth talking about today, and that's hacking. So Russia has been accused of hacking Ukrainian television several times throughout the war, but the most recent episode that's catching the headlines is something we talk about today in our paper, which is putting violent images from the war on children's channels and other TV channels in Ukraine. And there's been a series of complaints formally lodged to the International Telecoms Union, the ITU, from Ukraine and other European countries about satellite interference that has affected their navigation services and television shows. Now, supposedly it involves the jamming of GPS signals and is dangerous, not only because, of course, anything could be shown on television for inappropriate material for children, etc., but also endangering air traffic control, which relies on this kind of communication. The EU has come out saying how dangerous this is, and indeed has also got the United Nations involved too, documenting at least 11 cases of interference in the last 3 months, affecting dozens of Ukrainian television programmes. France, Sweden, the Netherlands and Luxembourg have also sent complaints, as I say, alleging harmful interference in their satellites. Estonia too has blamed Russia for tampering with navigation devices in airspace across the Baltic states. So I mention all this here because it would be an example of the hybrid warfare that's been ramped up by Moscow. Though that said, both sides have been reportedly engaged in hacking, not only in terms of television, but also in terms of other kind of hacking projects. So both Russia and Ukraine appeared to hack each other's television around the time of Moscow's Victory Day parade, with both sides trying to either show the parade somewhere where it wasn't being shown, in the case of Russia, and Russia allegedly trying to essentially big up the optics of it, whereas Ukraine were trying to show different footage to Russian TV networks, such as examples of war crimes being committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine. For instance, supposedly attacks from the city hall near Moscow were also shown to large numbers of the population. That's according to Ukrainian Pravda, as an attempt to draw attention to the ways in which Russia has been exposed to other vulnerabilities, namely Islamic terrorism, as a response to the ramping up of the war in Ukraine, and security elements not being able to be focused on that, as opposed to focusing all of their efforts on the war in Ukraine. Now, another case too recently is that the Ukrainian IT army, that's the term that's often used, is said to have launched a large-scale attack on the Russian banking system last week, including the infrastructure of the national payment card system, which brought several banks down for several hours. Now, inevitably, it's very hard to distinguish between random blokes in their bedroom having a go versus those that are state-sanctioned and are running on an official basis. But nonetheless, things are happening, and things are happening not only on a micro and macro level, but also internationally, which is why I mention it here. And I think when we hear intelligence chiefs talking about hybrid warfare and acts of sabotage and violence, it's these kind of things that also play into that. So it'll be good to talk about it again when we get a little bit more updates from the ITU and from the UN on this issue. But it's an interesting one, and so one I thought was important to address since it's in the news this week.
Well, thank you very much, Dom and Francis, for all of your work and reporting today. Let's move to our final thoughts. Dom Nicholls, can I start with you?
Yeah, thanks, David. So I have been looking at this whole business up at Vovchansk, so north of Kharkiv, this lodgement, this whatever it is, this thing that Russia put across the border a couple of months ago. Didn't really do a lot. It never managed to meet up. It had two forces, one sort of north of Kharkiv and one to the northeast, along the border area. They never linked up and they never pushed very far forward. They were quite quickly held, and they've now, for the last few days, very slowly but steadily been pushed back. And so we've talked about it a lot. Was it an attempt at opening up a new front, in which case that didn't work? Was it the diversion for a push somewhere else, Sumy perhaps, or the Donbass? That hasn't emerged. So quite what it is, it's not really doing a lot. It's not militarily effective for Russia anymore. Now, it might not have worked for whatever it was supposed to be. It might not have worked because of this change in policy from the US to allow US-donated weapons to be fired inside Russia. And that would have been knocking out headquarters positions, troop concentrations, logistic nodes inside Russia that would have supported and pushed on through those lodgements. So that might be it. But whatever the reasons are, it's left Russia in a bit of a pickle, Because we've seen a couple of times, and Roland talked about this the other day, a couple of times where Russia has withdrawn. Kherson, you remember, they got themselves across the river in good order, has to be said. We think it was Surovikin, General Surovikin. Where's Wally? Where is he? Still haven't seen him. I haven't seen him for a while. But anyway, it was supposed to be his idea that got the Russian troops back over the Dnieper River from the right bank, from the eastern bank. God, thinking about it now. Got them over in good order. But the other one, Kharkiv, as Roland mentioned, so the sort of latter part of 2022, that was just a chaotic, disorderly rout. It was a pell-mell dash by Ukraine. They chose where to stop before they overextended their lines. Now, Russia, obviously, if they're thinking now about getting out of Vovchansk in that area, they would want it to be the former. They would want it to be a discreet, covert, get the troops back in good order and save as much combat power as they can. But that's not really possible. They could do that in Kherson because they had the big river. And by the time Ukraine worked out what was going on, it was too late and there was a massive geographical boundary. You can't really do that in Vovchansk. Once they're over the border, possibly. But between where they are now, the outskirts of Vovchansk and the border itself, well, they can't just walk off. They can't just move away slowly. Breaking contact, or a rearward passage of lines, as it's called, in contact with the enemy is extremely difficult. Trying with one hand to punch the enemy whilst with the other hand move back and prepare your forces behind, it's extremely difficult. So that might not happen. And Russia certainly doesn't want a repeat of Kharkiv where they were just routed. So what might they do to try and stop that? Well, they might push troops forward up to the edge of the border. They might push artillery units there. They might try and push some other units to try and to allow their forces in Vovchansk to break contact and get back in good order. But because of this new change of policy, those troop concentrations are now going to be seen and targetable. So we haven't seen this kind of problem before in the war. It is only a very small area. Nothing on the scale of Kharkiv or Kherson, really, but it's presented Russia with a real problem. If they leave their people there, it looks like they will just be slowly attrited up to and including the border. But if they try and get their people out, how do they do it without them being targeted across the border? It is a very tricky tactical problem, and it's going to be interesting to see how Russia approach it. And that's what I've been keeping an eye on that for the last few days, reporting the news as we see it, but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, how the hell are they going to get themselves out of this problem that they've created for themselves? And after that, we will then have the conversation about, well, are there lessons here for what might be able to happen up and down the line by targeting beyond where you have been able to before for policy or equipment terms, and then what effect that can have on the tactical action. But a really knotty problem for Russia right now in the Vovchansk area.
Thank you very much, Dom. Francis, would you like to have the final words today?
Well, thanks, David. Just a brief one from me. I mentioned the incident of MH17 earlier, which was shot down by Russia-controlled forces at a time when really the world was not paying attention to Ukraine. And I won't go over the whole story again because we have talked about it in previous episodes and it'll be well known to many listeners, particularly in Europe. Although, as I said in a few weeks ago now, it is one of those incidents where if things had been slightly different and rather than it being Dutch passengers who were killed on such large numbers, if it was American passengers that were killed, I wonder what the response would have been with the annexation of Crimea, whether there would have been more of a sense of this being something that America needed to be much more closely involved in at the time. But as I say, that's one for historians to judge. The reason I bring it up again here is many listeners may well have seen on social media some footage circulating the past 24 hours or so, which is Russia collecting all of the remains of Il-76, that plane that was shot down in January in the Belgorod region. And supposedly it was hit by a Patriot. Again, this is all coming from Russia's perspective on this. The evidence is very thin indeed. And Moscow claimed that there were 65 Ukrainian prisoners of war on board that plane that were heading for an exchange. And then it was shot down by the Ukrainians by accident or deliberately, and they are now evidently trying to assemble this plane and make it something of a propaganda issue, something that resembles visually, at the very least, MH17, where they're compiling it and they're trying to do an investigation into what really happened. This is despite the fact that there's no real evidence that we've seen of there being 65 prisoners on board, and the video is available, even question whether it was Patriots that actually shot it down, and whether it might well indeed have been Russians that shot it down by accident or deliberately. And in terms of the numbers lost, it looks like there may have been about 10 people aboard, not, as I say, that 65. As I say, regardless of how many people were killed, it's still, of course, a terrible incident. But in terms of how it's being used by the Kremlin, I find this so interesting. I mean, you look at MH17, it's an incident that caused international ripples. It did not have a decisive impact, but it did lead many people to look at what was going on in Ukraine much more closely. And it had, as I say, visual and narrative power, given the nature of the tragedy. And I think what we're seeing here is Moscow trying to concoct a similar incident that it can use for its own propaganda, and particularly can point to, because as I say, it is visually striking when you reconstruct an entire plane from parts, which is what has been done in this footage, to be able to say, look, we are also doing our own investigations of Ukraine war crimes, to try and say that this is a war that everybody is implicated in, that it is not just good versus evil, etc., etc. So it's also designed for a Western audience. So I mention it, as I say, because it's another example, I think, of how the Kremlin very cleverly constructs these narratives and knows where it's deploying these visual messages in order to get maximum cut through for international audiences, which, as we know and have discussed at the moment, are trying to decide their responses to the war in Ukraine. So if you see that footage and you see it being shared by certain accounts on social media, just be aware that it's likely being deployed as a weapon of war, but in the information war, which of course remains as important as the one that is being waged on the battlefields of Ukraine at the moment.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 PM London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.